And on that sort of glum technical note, why don't we go ahead and get started? So Avant, I'll hand the mic to you. We can get going.
Okay. Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our event with our guest speaker, Professor Michael Vandenberg from Vanderbilt University. I'm Aubin Zaou, and I'm going to say a few words about our program funded by the European Commission through the H2020 and Marie Curie Fellowships. Next month, our series will also feature 3 different speakers, including Professor Daniel Walters from Penn State University, Michelle Oko from Duke University, and Smita Narula from Pace University. And the first one will be on April the 5th with Daniel Walters. Please visit our website, www.law.uh.edu/inner-center, where you'll find the upcoming events in the series and a great lineup of our past speakers and sessions. Feel free to use the chat box for your questions, and in due course, we are going to display the CLE credit slides. I now turn it back to Professor Tracy Hester, co-director of the Inner Center and our chair this morning.
And good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to see everyone virtually, at least. I'm Tracy Hester. I'm a professor here at the University of Houston Law Center, and I'm a co-director, along with Professor Victor Flatt, Professor Gina Warren, for our Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center. First of all, I would like to thank Aban for, as always, marshaling an incredibly impressive series of speakers with us this year. Before I hand the microphone over to our distinguished guest today, just a brief note to let everyone know that the Environment, Energy, and Natural Resource Center is a platform at the University of Houston dedicated to identifying and researching emerging issues at the intersection of energy and environmental law, which, given the host of issues being created, not only by the large-scale carbon transition, but also with the energy disruptions from the invasion of Ukraine, as well as the recent release of the SEC rule yesterday, there's always something interesting going on. I would like to just pass along news that we just released this morning, that we've also been the beneficiaries of a $10 million gift from Shell to help sponsor a platform for additional research specifically on carbon transition issues and social justice issues. So we're hoping that that will create greater opportunities for us to work with all of you out there and have additional speakers like our wonderful speaker today. It's my great pleasure to introduce then Michael Vandenberg. Michael is going to be speaking with us about the issues of ESG. He is the David Daniels Allen Distinguished Chair of Law at Vanderbilt Law School. I could go through his full resume, but 1, most of you know Michael already, and 2, it would take about 20 minutes of his time. So I will do the moderator's perk of giving him the microphone as quickly as possible, and hopefully we can add more to his background as part of the Q&A. Please, to reinforce, we will have an opportunity for you to ask questions directly at the end of his presentation, but you can also post your questions to the chat box, and we'll try and curate them as best we can and get to all of them before the end of our time today. And with that, Michael, the microphone is yours.
Fantastic. Thank you so much to Tracy and to Alban. This is a great opportunity, and the program you all have developed at Houston is truly impressive. Victor, Gina, Tracy are just leaders in the field in Alban. It's been great interacting with you to get this program set up. So thank you for doing all this, and thank you for the chance to have this conversation. I do hope that if along the way there are questions that need to get addressed, you'll insert yourselves. You know, I've been yelled at by senators and cabinet secretaries. I can't be offended by whatever it is you have to say. And I think what you'll find is that much of what I'm going to talk about is actually more unifying than it is polarizing, even though it's dealing with climate change, which is one of the most polarizing issues in our society today. I'm looking for ways to bring together people to solve problems in the work that I do. And I think this area is one of those that's doing so globally and not just domestically. So that's my goal here. And I'm really excited to be a part of it. So the paper is Governance by Contract, the Growth of Private Environmental Contracting. And what you're seeing is a presentation about a paper that hasn't yet been placed. So happy to take comments on it and potentially get changes made to the paper if you can point out things that you think need need to be made. And this is a topic I've been working on for quite a while. It draws on a book that I published with physicist Jonathan Gilligan a few years ago from Cambridge University Press. And chapter 5 and 6 of that book discuss some of these topics. And what I'm going to talk with you about today is some new empirical findings that I've developed that relate to supply chain contracting, which is a core piece of our message about what the private governance response to climate change can all be about. But I'm not just going to talk about climate change today, because supply chain contracting also involves many other environmental topics. So we'll get well beyond climate change, but it all draws on this basic theme that was presented in Beyond Politics. And I want to start with just the question of whether supply chain contracting matters. And as you all know, those of you who are following what the SEC did yesterday, Scope 3 supply chain contracting emissions are a piece of what the SEC is going to push us toward. But the SEC is following, not leading on this issue. And that's going to be the focus of what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what the private sector is doing, even without being required to do so by the SEC. So that'll be my focus today. And I just used this one quotation: supply chain decarbonization will be a game changer for the impact of corporate climate action. Addressing Scope 3 emissions is fundamental for companies to realize credible climate change commitments. It enables companies in consumer-facing sectors to use their influence in supply chains to speed and support rapid decarbonization throughout the economy. And it can put pressure on suppliers in regions where governments do not yet do so. So it does have global implications. And I would say too, as we go through this, I'm working with a number of lawyers on model supply chain contracting provisions. And one of the things we're finding is that it's not just a matter of putting pressure on suppliers. It's about providing information, resources too. Often the supplier relationship is not just a one-way relationship. Often the buyer of a good wants to provide the information to enable the supplier to help them provide the products they want with low carbon or lower toxics or whatever it might be. So I don't want to think about this at a global level as some kind of a coercion. In some cases, the buyer, of course, has market power. But in many cases, what we're seeing over and over is that the buyer is trying to facilitate the seller's ability to meet the buyer's commitments on its supply chain. Another way to think about this, and this is something I hear a great deal, is, oh my goodness, this corporate activity must just be greenwashing because companies don't have financial incentives to reduce their carbon footprint or their toxics or their effects on deforestation. So when you see corporate action, your guard should be up because this must just be greenwashing. And this report, which got major coverage in science magazines and then in the media, is often where I find that students and the media and critics ask me questions about whether all this is greenwashing. So the New Climate Institute does a study of corporate climate responsibility. It looks at the pledges of 25 large companies, and it concludes that they only reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% on average, not the 100% suggested by their net zero and carbon neutral claims. And so my question for you is, well, if that's true, it probably is true. I have no reason to believe it's not true. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? So would we like for them, if we care about climate change, to reduce their emissions by 100%? Absolutely. We'd like them to fulfill those commitments. But then my question for those who are skeptics in this area is, what government program is requiring companies to achieve 40% reductions by large companies? Which one? Where? Where in the United States? Which state? Which city? So my view is that these kinds of critiques of the greenwashing implications of much of the private environmental governance that we see really arise from a much deeper concern about markets as a general phenomenon. And that's not something that I share as much, but I think it's better to tease that out and really wrestle with that a little bit, rather than to assume that a 40% reduction is not a positive thing. Now, it's not a positive thing if it discourages governments or other private activity from getting to 100%. That's certainly true. But when you look at recent studies of what countries are doing at the global level, what states are doing, and what cities are doing, you find that a 40% reduction is remarkably strong, remarkably good. And when all we do is critique corporate reductions for not achieving 100% of what they claim to do, we begin to those companies from stepping forward and doing what they are doing. So I have some real concerns about the general focus. I think greenwashing is a very big issue, but the general focus on assuming that if you're not achieving 100% reductions, you're engaging in greenwashing is something that I believe is not an accurate reflection of where we might possibly go with climate mitigation and with many of the other environmental issues we face. So that's where we're going to go with this talk a little bit, is to think about how we can be more critical in our thinking about what we mean by greenwashing and how we can deal with greenwashing concerns as it relates to supply chains. So I begin with, again, if nothing else for the audience today, we need to realize that we all function using mental models. And the famous John Kenneth Galbraith noted that faced with a choice between changing one's mind and proving there's no need to do so, almost everyone gets busy with the proof. That is, we start collecting information that validate what our current mindset is. And my view is one of the great values of law school and of any good critical education is it forces us to realize that we have these mental models. And we use these mental models to ignore information that's inconvenient to us. And one of those comes in this area of supply chain contracting. We'll get more into that in a moment. The 9/11 Commission said we didn't lack the data necessary to understand that 9/11 might occur, but we lacked the imagination among the top agencies that dealt with this area to put it all together in one place and realize what a big event that could possibly be. It was a failure of imagination, not the lack of existence of data, that caused us not to anticipate and avoid 9/11. And again, I believe the same thing is occurring in much of the environmental law and policy area as well. And I just love this quote by the captain of the Titanic, Edward Smith. I cannot imagine which would cause this ship to founder. And so, of course, if you can't imagine that the ship could founder, then you're going to run through a field of icebergs at high speed, which is exactly what they did, and you're going to hit some icebergs. So my request to the audience today is just, no matter what you do, no matter where you are politically, what field you're in, whether you're in an NGO representing a firm or a student or a law professor, don't be Captain Smith. Don't just take that failure of imagination and run it through the way you think about environmental law and governance, because we're in an era where it's going to take some really creative and thoughtful thinking outside of the existing mental models to get from here to there. Related to that is where those mental models come from. And what is becoming dominant in psychology is incredibly important for law students to understand, which is that we have a dual process form of cognition. That is that much of what we think of as our rational process actually begins with a system one process. In other words, an intuition that we all have. And this happens a lot with moral values. We think that we have reached a moral judgment based on our logic. But the fact is, much of our moral reasoning can be explained through a deeper intuition that we have, that's system one, that we then process through our conscious thinking as if it were a logical outcome, and that's system two. So we walk around thinking that we're engaging in just very logical processes, but those logical processes correspond much better to our deeper intuitions that occur subconsciously than to our conscious thought. And when you realize that, it helps you begin to think about how you can get out of your mental models, how your deeper intuitions might be liberal or conservative, but understanding the deeper intuitions of those who are not like you is critical in a democracy. The famous journalist H.L. Mencken said a democracy is not getting everyone to think the same way. It's getting people to think who think differently to act the same way. And to me, that's the essence of the success of the American democracy. When it occurs, we get people from lots of different viewpoints to all act the same way. And the reason I spend so much time on this issue is that if you're on the left, you may be really uncomfortable with the idea that supply chain contracting can be a form of global governance that can help reduce the climate problem. If you're on the right, you may be uncomfortable with the idea that we should worry about anything other than near-term quarterly pecuniary gains from market activity. And I would suggest to you that neither one of those is an accurate state of where the world is today. And it's not a productive way to think about where we might get from here to avoiding catastrophic climate change, avoiding high toxics exposures, and a range of other issues. So again, the underlying goal here for this morning is for us all to realize we have mental models, they cause these failures of imagination, and being aware of that can help us avoid that. And I'm going to dive in now to think about how that can happen as to environmental governance and supply chain contracting. So if your answer to the climate problem is we need a carbon tax, which it is for many people, the question then is, can we get a carbon tax? And here you see the major pollution control for the first 20 years of environmental law from 1970 to 1990, and we get over a dozen major pollution control statutes. Since the massive Clean Air Act amendments of 1990, my argument would be we've had only one, which would be the Lautenberg amendments to the Toxic Substances Control Act in 2016. But again, if your thinking is either you want to scale back environmental protection or you want to extend it to meet new information about toxics and the climate threat in particular, the challenge is, what does that suggest about where we're likely to go in the future? Are we going to get a carbon tax? And the same thing is true here as it relates to major international agreements. We've had some important ones, but ones that have fallen short in many cases. So at the federal level and at the international level, the argument is, let's not be naive. Let's not apply what we sometimes call Disney's law to the likelihood of statutes being adopted or major international agreements that will solve the problem. So why might that be true? Well, look, votes by members of the House and Senate. Across the top are the Democrats, across the bottom are Republicans on major environmental statutes as scored by the League of Conservation Voters. And what you see here is a massive gap opening up after 1990. And remember that 1990 was the last year that we had a major pollution control statute, with the exception of Lautenberg amendments, again, which I'm happy to talk about. I think they prove my point if we want to dig into that. So correlation doesn't prove causation. Just because this gap opens doesn't mean that that caused the failure of major pollution control statutes, but the correlation is remarkable. And we should all at least be aware that there's a good chance here that what is really going on is that in our democratic system, you cannot adopt major pollution control statutes without bipartisanship. And bipartisanship almost doesn't exist anymore on environmental protection, at least as to major statutes. So one of the things I hear mostly from my colleagues more on the left is that we don't need to worry so much about changing public opinion among moderates and conservatives as it relates to climate change, because the number of people who are either alarmed or concerned about climate change has increased from roughly 45% of the population to roughly 55% of the population. And at 55% of the population in democracy, the assumption, I guess, is that that's enough. And at some point, we'll just get it once we overcome the pesky resistance to major climate action. My argument would be the reverse. And we call this sometimes Disney's law. Why? Wishing will make it so, right? If we are concerned about climate change, we wish that 55% of the population would make it so, would allow us to adopt federal policies that would reduce the risk of catastrophic climate change. But the fact of the matter is that we need to take a harder look at those numbers. And when you do that, when you ask, what about supporting federal climate legislation or major federal policy, what you see is that Democrats over the last decade have increased from roughly 68% to roughly 83%, but independents haven't really changed their views about whether we need federal action. And Republicans have gone down significantly over that last decade. So the challenge then is, if 83% of Democrats and roughly 50% of independents support doing something major with federal policy, is that enough in our democratic system? Or are we following Disney's law if we just assume that it is, wishing will make it so? And my argument for you would be that in our very polarized world, and by the way, I think Ezra Klein's book, Why We're Polarized, is a remarkably successful public analysis of why we are as polarized as we are and what the implications are of that. So we live in little closed information ecosystems. We're only hearing things that people in our team or tribe or group suggest is information that we want to hear. We're sorting ourselves out geographically and in civic and cultural groups and religious groups and in neighborhoods into different tribes, in effect. And research shows that you can take a group of people and you can tell them that you're randomly dividing them into two different groups. And within minutes, they will begin attributing good characteristics to their group and bad characteristics to the other group, even though they know they are randomly attributed. So imagine what happens then if we have leaders, both in the media and in politics, who benefit by creating greater divisions. We have a deep system one intuition to view our group as the good one and the other group as the bad one. And people can play on that through information. A great analysis suggests this can be called tribal epistemology. In other words, our system of thought is functioning as if we are in a tribe, and we look to our tribal leaders to tell us what we can believe. So if I want to know whether someone thinks the economy is doing well, I don't ask about GDP figures. I ask whether their candidate is now in the White House, because that's a better predictor of whether they think the economy is doing well than the actual GDP figures. So think about that as a way for the environmental governance system to function a little bit. In the US population, roughly 40% of the population identified as Republican and 42% as Democrat, according to a just recent Gallup poll. Liberals make up about a quarter of the population, conservatives between a quarter and a third, roughly. And so that's the world that we live in. And again, if we're not going to follow Disney's law and just assume that tomorrow we'll get some major new statute or regulatory regime, we need to be realistic then about where the opportunities are. One last quick point that I'll say is that the Senate, 50 votes in the US Senate are controlled by 18% of the US population. So again, that's largely a rural, small state population. So just think about the implications of that for the likelihood of getting a silver bullet answer, or whether or not it's time to walk away from Disney law just a bit. So compounding that is this mental model that what I was taught in law school is that environmental law is a subfield of administrative law. And that's the way it's practiced and taught in many people's minds right now. And if that's true, then we ask, well, what can government do? And a good example, this is a great book, which I highly recommend. Jim Salzman and Buzz Thompson have the leading environmental law and policy from the Concepts and Insights series. And it starts with the definition of environmental law that says the use of public authority to protect natural environment and human health from the impacts of pollution and development is what environmental law is. And if that's true, then we're number one, because if you see here on the left, we're getting close to tax time. The tax code is famously long and complex, but the environmental code on the right there is twice as long, basically. So if that's environmental law, if it's a matter of public authority, then we're locked in. Then we're focused on, well, how do we change that underlying dynamic that I just talked about? But my argument for the rest of our conversation this morning is that that's the wrong question to ask. It's the wrong mental model to be in. We need to think about governance, not government. And we need to ask not what can government do, we need to ask what can any organization do. And that's what supply chain contracting is all about. And when we do that, now lots of options open up to us that are not barred in the same way as we see major federal action. If I am a member of Congress, I can gerrymander my markets, right? I can gerrymander my voters. If I'm Dick's Sporting Goods, I need to sell to the entire country. I can't gerrymander my market in the same way that a member of the political class can gerrymander the political system. So what we're beginning to see, in my view, is a much more interesting phenomenon that I call market democracy, where we're beginning to see the marketplace perform the governmental functions that we wish our government would perform for those of us who want to see major societal threats addressed. So let's dig into that. And this is the traditional model of what we study. Government regulates firms. Firms are the polluters. We ask what legislative and executive functions can occur, and then we think about court decisions in that basic model. This is from a political scientist from just a couple of weeks ago. We have all kinds of examples of that. What's interesting then is that over time, more and more, the business community, political economy, and many other firms think more and more about how markets react to firms and what that might mean. So, as a political scientist, many people then begin focusing on, well, how do unorganized interests and organized interests in the political system affect the government, which then affects the regulation of firms? And again, that's a very standard model. This is what you would be taught in most classes as an undergraduate or graduate. But what has occurred in the last 2 decades is a growing understanding that the issue is not just unorganized and organized interests affecting government, affecting firms that then causes market reactions, but that there are a range of non-market reactions as well: boycotts, information, government recalls, lawsuits, and other things that are important to study. And David Barron at the Stanford Business School is famous for having really developed a lot of the theoretical infrastructure for this kind of an approach. What I'm suggesting to you today is that that is all very important, but it's time to take another step. And that next step is when these unorganized and organized interests fail at being able to get government to reflect their preferences, as is occurring on things like climate change, they quite naturally then take those arrows and they don't just direct them toward government, they begin directing those arrows toward firms directly. And then those firms don't just engage in market reactions, they engage in the kind of reactions that we're going to see for the rest of the conversation, which is about supply chain contracting. Those firms then become regulators of other firms. So we're making 2 core changes to the basic mental model that is taught in law schools and is used by many people in this field. We're moving who those interests are focusing on to firms and not just to government. And then we're moving firms into a regulatory role of other firms as well. And that's the way I view supply chain contracting. One firm is regulating another firm. How important is this? Well, one quick example. I would argue that Walmart is one of the biggest regulators of carbon emissions in the world today. They have committed to 1 billion tons of carbon emissions reductions from their supply chain. That's an amount equal to Germany or Japan going carbon neutral for an entire year. And they have between 50 and over 100,000 suppliers around the world. So they're creating a global network of contracting requirements to reduce carbon emissions, in many cases, overcoming the barriers of the international process, overcoming the barriers of state and federal limits on what we can do on climate change, and doing so from a company that's not historically famous for being liberal, right? So to me, Project Gigaton by Walmart is a good example of what we're seeing. Walmart is feeling pressure from a range of different places, seeing economic advantages, and then regulating the firms in its supply chains, which extend around the world. That is, from my perspective, private governance, and that is what I see supply chain contracting being a part of. So if you were, again, taught in law school or in business school 10 years ago, what you were learning is that corporate social responsibility, socially responsible investing was kind of an interesting altruistic exercise. But what you learned then is now out of date, because what has happened since about 2012, if you look at this graph, which I didn't put together, but is in a blog post called Capitalism Heal Thyself by Alan Palmater, who's a corporate law professor at Wake Forest, what it shows is a real inflection point in about 2012, where we begin to see the movement from SRI and CSR type investing, which required some element of altruism in many cases, to what we now talk about as environmental, social, and governance investing, or ESG investing. And now there is so much money going into those areas that it is now no longer necessary to care one way or the other from an altruistic perspective about social good. If you want to maximize profits in many cases, you're not going to do so if so much investing is in the ESG space that the companies in the ESG space are better performing in the marketplace than those that are not. And I would argue that underneath all this is the growing idea of the universal or common owner. And I think that's worth taking just a minute on, because it helps us explain the drivers for the supply chain contracting that are the focus of today's discussion. So the notion of universal owner is that modern portfolio theory induced large institutional investors to try to reduce transaction costs by building large diversified funds. You can't beat the market. So what do you do with pension funds and other things? You put them in large index funds. That way you reduce transaction costs, and you don't try to beat the market. You try to ride the upswing as the market becomes more productive over time. The product of that is tremendous amounts of equities are now held in large index funds. Some people have said as much as 80% of equities are held in that fashion. So what does that mean if you're a BlackRock or a Vanguard or a Fidelity or a Wellington? That means that you own the market on behalf of your clients. You don't just benefit by one company making money by harming another company. You only benefit if we have a stable political system, so you're opposed to insurrections, and you only benefit if we have a stable climate, so you're opposed to catastrophic climate change as well. Why are you doing that? Are you doing that because you have some liberal bent? No, it's because your financial investments are the marketplace. They're not just one sector. Now, there are some challenges, because in some cases you also might own various funds and specific stocks that are not in these large diversified funds. So this isn't an easy topic. But as a general rule, large institutional investors now own the market. And as a result, they don't have an economic benefit for some companies to make money by harming other companies within their portfolio. And that, to me, suggests this major transformation that's underway in the core financial incentives that investors have in pushing companies to engage in the kind of supply chain contracting that I'm about to talk a little bit more about now. So again, I think 2012 should be seen as an inflection point. If you're citing papers or relying on training that occurred before about 2012, what you're doing makes a lot of sense in an old mental model, but it's time to shift to a new mental model. And that mental model acknowledges that ESG investing has become something that is in the economic interest of many actors because of the success of modern portfolio theory, leading us to these major universal owners. And do they matter or not? Well, BlackRock has $11 trillion in assets under management. That's like the GDP of China. right, for an annual, for a year. So these investments really matter. One argument I've heard is that the 30 plus largest institutional investors own more than half of all the shares of the S&P 500. So to the extent those are universal owners, you can see how much influence they might have over time. What kinds of effects do we see on this? Well, Maersk handles about a quarter of all the shipping around the globe, and it's committed to go carbon neutral, and it's doing that under pressure from its largest customers. And it's telling its largest customers that it is going to ship their goods on ships that can be characterized as carbon neutral. So that's an example to me of where suppliers and supply chain pressure, in this case with the shipping company like Maersk, are beginning to have an effect even on the transport of goods around the world at a very large level. So let's talk about a couple of greenwashing concerns here. The question that I think I can answer in this paper is the first one, and I think of it as a matter of prevalence. In other words, all of this thinking about what is going on with firms would just be greenwashing if firms are not sufficiently imposing on their suppliers at a large enough scale the kind of requirements they're committing to. So the challenge, the firm is committing, let's say, to reduce its carbon emissions, but if most of its carbon emissions are coming from its scope 3 suppliers, then its commitment looks good on the surface, but it only looks good because it's excluding its scope 3 suppliers from its commitment. And so to respond to this first greenwashing concern, what this paper does is it looks into the question of how many of the largest firms around the world actually are imposing environmental requirements on their suppliers. Again, because if they're not, then we would worry that firms would be making commitments when they're essentially just excluding outside the boundaries of what they're reporting the emissions that they're actually responsible for. And that could include greenhouse gas emissions. It could also include toxics and a range of other things. We'll get to 2 other greenwashing concerns in a moment. So on the toxic side, is there anecdotal reasoning to believe that that supply chain contracting really matters? And here's a comment from an industry lobbyist. The loss of public confidence in the public regulatory system means we're going to increasingly have retailers that are regulators like Walmart and Target. And that's what we see in the toxics area. And I have a paper called Beyond Lamarck, which explains that if you look carefully at the dynamics of the 2016 Lautenberg amendments to the Toxic Substances Control Act, what you see is that, in fact, it is the fact that the private sector was already through its supply chains regulating toxics so stringently that enabled the compromises to be reached to get that one exception to the lack of major new statutes over the last 30 years. The Lautenberg amendments, I would argue, are actually the product of the fact that Walmart and Target and Hewlett-Packard and others, through their supply chains, were regulating toxics to the extent that it was no longer in industry's interest to try to stop the update of a major federal statute in the area. But what about other kinds of emissions? Well, as to climate change, recent research suggests that a company's supply chain emissions are often 11 times more than their direct emissions. And that occurs in many sectors. In some sectors, it's as high as 28 times the emissions from the supply chain as from the original company itself. And one study suggests that in 2021, 8 of the leading global supply chains accounted more than 50% of all global emissions. So supply chains really matter in many ways. So let's take a look then at some thinking about the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So that's an initiative that is a combined effort between private industry and NGOs. And it suggests that businesses whose scope 3 sources account for 40% of their annual emissions need to report when they report their emissions and make commitments to reduce those emissions through the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So through the SBTI, what we see is through a private initiative, if scope 3 sources account for 40% or more of your emissions, then you have to report them to SBTI. And I'm just now looking at, I have it literally right here in front of me. I'm still looking at the new SEC requirements, but I think something quite similar, as we study it, we'll find appears in the new SEC draft regulation as well. And this is an example where the private sector through SBTI is leading conceptually and how it frames supply chain contracting requirements. And it looks as though the SEC is picking that up and running with it. Although again, I need to study that more over the next day or two. So what I did in 2005 was to look at the 10 largest firms in 8 sectors. And I found that roughly half of them disclose environmental supply chain contract, even though there is no legal requirement at the time in 2005 that would require that. So already we had roughly 50% of the firms in 8 leading global sectors, and I included business to business sectors and business to consumer sectors to try to tease out whether this is a consumer driven phenomenon or whether this is something that's much deeper, coming from investors and insurers and lenders and employees. And I found very little difference between business to business sectors and business to consumer sectors, suggesting that this isn't just about responding to consumer demand. So in this paper that we're talking about today, what I did essentially is update the findings from 15 years ago. So remember, 15 years ago, what we saw was 50% of the firms in 8 leading global sectors. Now, as any of you who've done empirical work know, it is very hard to update a prior research. Things change. And in this area, the name of the firm that and structure of the firm that does the rankings has changed. The sectors themselves have changed, and some of the firms within the sectors have changed as they've sold off businesses or added new businesses, et cetera. So what I tried to do in this research, working with Patty Moore, who is an excellent researcher on this project and now is in private practice, is to try to put together a comparable apples to apples comparison. And we were able to do this in several different ways. And what you see here on the left are the different sectors that I used 15 years ago to assess that 50% number. And on the right, we looked at analogous sectors, sectors that were as close today to the sectors as identified 15 years ago as we could possibly get. And what you see in that right-hand column are the percentages from our current study, sector by sector, of the number of firms or percentage of firms in each sector that are imposing environmental requirements on their suppliers. And I'm going to take a look with you at a couple different ways to look at this. We looked firm by firm. That is, we took the exact same firm 15 years ago and studied whether or not today that same firm is imposing supply chain requirements on their suppliers. And what we did here is we excluded those firms that had sold off businesses that were different. And so we found 69 firms that were the same today as they were 15 years ago. And of those 69 firms, the number that have moved to including environmental requirements is now 87% of those firms. We also looked sector by sector. So firms that are in the exact same sectors from then and now, and we found 75% of those firms are the same. And then we looked at the comparable sectors and we found 84% of those firms the same. So overall, a very rough number that's fair, in my view, is that just over 80% of all the firms in the 7 sectors that are comparable to the 8 we studied 15 years ago are now imposing environmental requirements on their suppliers. So that means that we've moved from 50% of all firms to 80% of all firms. And these are the 10 largest firms in 7 of the leading global sectors around the world. So we're really talking about a very widespread phenomenon here, which means from my perspective, I'm going to skip this, that the prevalence argument can be laid to rest. I don't think you can make a greenwashing claim that firms are not imposing on their suppliers environmental requirements. They may not always be effective. They may not be as broad as some of us might like, but it is very common for firms now to impose environmental requirements on their suppliers. So Tracy, I'm going to go for a couple more minutes and then stop for questions if that works for you. Excellent. So let's wrap up with 2 last considerations. Another very legitimate greenwashing concern is environmental effects. Maybe even if environmental supply chain requirements are in place, they're not having effects on the firm. And that effect could either be in the firm behavior, that is, how do they act, or it could be on the environmental harms caused by the firm. Those are not identical things for anybody who's studied environmental enforcement, as I have over the years would know. Or it could be that even if they are having environmental effects, they're undermining the likelihood of adoption of more effective governmental effects, in which case that could be another form of greenwashing. So let's really quickly look at those, and then I want to set aside time for comments. So why do I think that it's very likely these are having very substantial effects? Again, in law school, we tend to teach what's on the left side of this chart. We tend to teach that what you need is a legal license to operate. And therefore, what you want to do is study the Constitution, statutes, regulations, guidances, and enforcement activities of those requirements, federal, state, and local. And then you want to study tort law as well. And I include tort law in the legal license to operate, but you could call it private law if you want to. It's up to you. But that's what we study for the most part in law school. What I found from my own private practice where I represented investment banks and Fortune 100 companies is very little of what I did actually involved the legal license to operate. Much of what I did was advising clients and dealing with transactions where it was the social license to operate that was dominating what was going on. And that means pressure from investors, banks, lenders, corporate customers, that's supply chain contracting, retail customers, employees, and the norms of managers themselves. And what we're seeing more and more is as government is unable in the world that we're working in that's so deeply polarized to adopt new statutes that reflect the preferences of employees and customers and others, we're seeing more and more the social license to operate is emerging. And because of that actual pressure from the social license to operate, I'm optimistic that many of these supply chain contracting requirements are actually meaningful because they're being imposed by companies that are subject from investors and lenders and others. So here's just a list of the kinds of pressures on the left that we would teach in a traditional law school class about how businesses engage with government. They want to reduce government regulations, shape it, anticipate it, or raise their rivals' costs. Those are classic ways that we might think of companies in engaging with government. But on the right are the things that we now need to be thinking about in this world where it's private governance as much as public governance in many cases that matters. Companies can benefit by accelerating efficiency. They find huge gains when they reduce the waste associated with energy waste and other things. They may want to assure supply. They may be big enough to wipe out entire fisheries and things like that. So they may want to assure supply through things like the Marine Stewardship Council, which protects the sustainability of fish. They care deeply about their brand or their reputation, which makes up more than half the value of many firms. They do respond to retail customers. They do what we're talking about principally here, respond to corporate customers and supply chains. Investors, we've talked about, BlackRock and others. Lenders are incredibly important in this area. Roughly 24 insurers are reducing their willingness to insure fossil fuel heavy projects. They respond deeply to employee morale. We're seeing that in the tech industry right now. We're seeing that at Disney right now. And then they respond to the norms of managers who have the space to actually act once the business judgment rule gives them the ability to do so on things that might help the long-term value of the company rather than the short-term. So this is from a paper I had in Nature Climate Change just about a month ago. And it simply shows different label types that if you think consumers are driving this area, you don't use the simple labels on the left, certificate or ordinal ratings. But if you think, as I do, that actually quantification of carbon emissions is driving corporate behavior change, even when customers don't need much, then what you want to do is include a quantitative number as well to induce the firm to identify and disclose the carbon emissions. And there is a lot of good information out there that shows that when firms do this, they find efficiencies and they reduce their carbon footprint, even if consumer willingness to pay for lower carbon goods is quite low. So for those reasons, I think there are good reasons to believe that firms are incentivized to actually act on these supply chain contracting requirements. And the last thing I'll talk about is spillover effects. Even if they do that, is this private supply chain contracting and private governance more generally undermining the likelihood that we'll get adequate government action? And I think not. Again, you see that there are organizations like REBA, the Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, that are encouraging government action, not trying to discourage it. You also see that in some cases like the Anwar drilling leasing phenomenon late in the Trump administration, that major banks were resisting the exploration for more oil and gas. And I know that's a controversial issue, but again, not one where the big banks are trying to discourage decarbonization. Sometimes you see that the private sector is complementing government action. The example of that would be the 5 major automakers who agreed to apply the California tailpipe standards nationwide when California adopted its standard. Sometimes you see filling gaps in government action. And then lastly, you do see discouraging government action in some cases. Here's an example that could be quite relevant to a Texas audience. Here's Catherine Hayhoe, who many of you are familiar with, says, after speaking to a group of Texas producers in Amarillo, one man said it best: everything you've said makes sense, and I'd like to agree with you. But if I agree with you, I'd have to agree with Al Gore, and I could never do that, right? Now, what does that tell us? I think that tells us that much of what we're doing that we think of as the system 2 logical thinking about how we want to deal with the climate problem, is climate a real problem or not, is really system 1 intuition about what it is that our group can believe in and does believe in. So why do I think that private governance and supply chain contracting in particular is not undermining more support for government action? Well, the reason is research that we've conducted that shows that we can respond to these kinds of concerns because they are solution aversion. Many people, myself included, are hesitant about big government, right? We don't like big government intuitively, but what we can see with the private sector action is it's not a big government solution to the problem. We're not opposed to dealing with the climate problem. We're just worried about the solution being a big coercive, invasive government. But what the private sector suggests to us is that markets are in some cases responding. And what our research shows is that moderates and conservatives are more supportive of dealing with problems like climate change when they realize that the solution can be, in part, a private sector solution, not just a public sector solution. So we can avoid solution aversion by focusing on the private sector, which suggests that it's not simply going to undermine support for government action. So I'll leave it at that so we have enough time for questions. I could go on forever if you wanted me to, but I want to leave with one last set of things here. What can we do as individuals if we think that the idea of private sector action is a good idea? The first one I would say is stay optimistic. It's easy to get down about any one of these issues over time, but the research in health psychology shows that in the absence of a sense of efficacy that you can actually change a problem, and an internal locus of control, that is the sense that you control your own behavior. In the absence of those, you can't really make a lot of change. But if you have those two, you can. And being optimistic about the future, like I am, is an important piece of that. I think secondly, understanding your mental models, how you need to think outside them. You need to be aware that if you're liberal, everyone around you is probably liberal, and they're probably telling you things that's all liberal. If you're conservative, same thing is true. But in a democracy, if we're going to have a successful society, we've got to understand, and we've got to have what a physician that I work with as we try to decarbonize the medical centers calls empathy. We need to understand what the other side thinks, what the other group thinks, even if it's not what we think intuitively. And we need to reach some kind of forward progress. We can't simply fall into these tribal groups that the tribal epistemology would suggest is happening. Then I think that we need to avoid Disney's law. We've got to account for feasibility. We can't just say wishing will make it so. And if we do that, I think then we turn to private governance and we start seeing many ways to fill gaps. And below, I won't walk through all these, but below are just examples of different things that people are doing right now to harness the power of the private sector to try to decarbonize, because the private sector these days, in my view, is as or more responsive to the preferences of the American population than is our governmental system in many cases. So with that, I'm going to be quiet now, Tracy, and either I get your questions or those from the audience if we have them.
Thank you. What a fascinating and wonderful presentation. My only regret is that we didn't book you for 3 hours.
The scary thing is that I would talk for 3 hours if you gave me the chance to do so.
And it would be just as much fun. We do have at least one question available on chat, which I just lost when Alban shared the screen. But Alban, why don't you go ahead and do the CLE and then I'll ask the question. And you're muted still. Okay.
I'm going to post it on in the chat box.
Okay, thank you. So we do have at least one question that's been posted by a participant, and Keith Bettinger. If you could turn on your camera and your microphone, you could ask it directly, or I could relay it for you. It's your choice. Okay, then why don't I go ahead and add?
Hello,
Okay.
I think I had to find the buttons. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Thanks. Thanks for that excellent presentation, Professor. I really like how you anchored things to the cognitive processes. That's really brilliant. My question is on the supply chain greening. In your work, have you begun to see if companies in these sectors that you examined, are they starting to make investments in their supply chain and in the vendors that they deal with, particularly primary sector commodity providers, in improving those companies' ability to meet these higher standards? Is that something that's their responsibility? Over. Thank you.
Yes. Absolutely. And I would say that was a revelation to me. When I got into this, I thought of supply chain contracting as effectively the buyers using their market power to push the sellers to do something the sellers didn't want to do. And what I'm learning more and more as I work with people who function in this field and we try to develop model contracts in this area, et cetera, is that much of what's actually happening out there is that it's an information and resource transferal from the buyers to the sellers, or from a combined effort sometimes among the buyers and NGOs that will step in, because the NGOs want to see the outcome and they sometimes have the information necessary to make this happen. So more and more, I think we are seeing those kind of resource transfers. I don't know the commodity space as well, but I can give you a really good example from the tech area, which is when Apple was demanding that its Chinese suppliers provide low carbon components for the things that it sells around the world. Its Chinese suppliers objected because they were driven from a coal-fired electric power network. And so they couldn't actually produce the components that would meet the Apple requirements. And so what Apple did is, combined with some others, it provided the equivalent of 2 full power plants worth of renewable power to its suppliers in China to allow those Chinese suppliers to then meet the requirements of Apple. And I think we are seeing that over and over again. We're seeing actually raw provision of low carbon energy or whatever it might be, but we're also seeing provision of information. And then secondly, related to that, we're seeing more and more buyers asking the seller, in some cases as a first step, to simply provide information to the buyer about carbon and toxics and other things. So in some cases, what we're seeing as a first step is not the demand for changed environmental performance, but we're seeing the initial step being the collection of information. So for example, I have a part that will come out in a book chapter with a former pharmaceutical executive, which is a model contract provision that is asking the suppliers to the pharmaceutical industry to better disclose toxics in the manufacturing of the supply chain products. And that would be an example where the information flows first. And my guess is, in that process, what you're going to see is a lot of the buyers helping the sellers figure out, how do we quantify and report those emissions in order to meet the buyer's requirements. So there's an example where it's the exchange of expertise that's happening. The other place that we're seeing some real movement is that buyers of agricultural products are beginning to think about ways to provide farmers with ways to ensure that their production occurs in ways that can produce lower carbon from the production of the goods, but also can be done in ways where you can produce carbon offsets as a part of that agricultural production, and gives the farmers the incentive because it gives them more revenue as well. So any one farmer may not have the expertise to produce carbon offsets in the way that they do their farming, but a big intermediary in that commodity process might have that. And so we're starting to see that transfer of information that enables the farmer to see a lower cost from producing goods that the buyer wants to buy. And I think that's going to be a common phenomenon moving forward.
All right, I think we may have time for one more question, and they'll take away my moderator's license if I don't ask at least one myself. So I was curious, in terms of market action by private actors, is there a risk of incommensurate action? You can have, of course, corporations having uniform goals of CO2 reductions or other types of performance measures, but the way that they choose to accomplish them may actually conflict with each other. Choice between hydrogen or between electrification or between other types of maybe using direct air capture as opposed to biological. Is there any sense that the market is going to be able to sort through these in a way that would reduce some of those conflict choices in a way that regulation might be able to tackle head on?
I think that's a great question. It's not one that I've heard before. My sense is that, as a general rule, the benefit of using the marketplace is you tend to get more heterogeneity in responses, and that certainly for a while here, I'm agnostic on how we meet a lot of these standards, as long as we actually meet them. And I'm sure we're going to see some greenwashing. But so, an example would be, as we build out a national network of electric charging stations for vehicles, how do we make sure, I know this is exactly the question you're asking, but how do we make sure that we don't build out a network that then becomes technologically outdated within a couple of years? And I think a strength, as I see it, of the kind of private governance responses through supply chains is that we probably will have lots of differences within the ways that firms are meeting obligations. And my own thinking would be, that's probably more of a good thing than a bad thing. It probably will cause some inefficiencies along the way, but we probably need to try lots and lots and lots of different ways of meeting these requirements. So I love that idea. And I think, Tracy, there's probably a paper for you to write in that area, because I think trying to balance the value of letting lots of flowers bloom versus the value of concentrating on a couple of winning systems is going to be a fascinating thing. And I'm not an expert at that, but I'll bet you there's a deep literature on promoting technological innovation through markets that could tell us something about how we ought to be structuring our supply chain contracting now to gain the right balance between promoting innovation and promoting the efficiency of large common systems. And I think that's a great topic for additional work.
Well, the only way I'd ever write that paper is if you and I co-authored it. So
Let's think about that.
with that, I think our time is about up, and I'd like to let Alban have a chance to remind everybody about the CLE credit and our upcoming speaker. But before I do, my most important duty, which is to thank Professor Vandenberg for a wonderful presentation, fascinating ideas, and looking forward to meeting and talking with you again soon, Michael.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for the opportunity, both Tracy and Alban, and congratulations on where you've taken the Houston Center. It's very impressive.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So our next speaker will be Daniel Waters, and it will be on April the 5th, next month. Thank you.
Oh, also, one question that popped up in the chat box. We will be providing a recording and hopefully the slides at our website in the future. So you'll have access to this information if you should want it. Thank you everyone again for joining us today.